Beneath the cold steel of Manhattan's towers, something ancient stirred, a roar not of traffic or commerce, but of purpose. On a spring day, April 30th, amidst the echo of hurried footsteps and neon lights, a different kind of power rose from the ground up. It did not come in suits or sirens, but in the voices of Africans, scattered across the globe but united in conviction. They came to Times Square, not to marvel at the spectacle of the West, but to confront it, to reclaim space, to bear witness, to declare, without apology or hesitation, Africa is no longer kneeling. The drums of the diaspora beat out their defiance. They carried flags, banners, and memories. They chanted names like Sankara and Lumumba, not as ghosts but as guideposts. The faces in the crowd were Malian, Nigerian, Congolese, Senegalese, Burkinabe. But their message transcended borders. It was Pan-African, born from a shared scar and a common dream. And at the heart of this rising tide stood one name, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. A soldier-turned-statesman, he had emerged from the turmoil of Burkina Faso not just as a leader, but as a symbol. To many, he embodied the continent's hunger for sovereignty, raw, unfiltered, and uncompromising. To others, he was a threat to be contained, silenced, or removed. But to the people gathered in the cold breath of New York's wind, he was something greater. A flicker of Sankara reborn. A challenge to a system that had, for centuries, dictated Africa's fate from boardrooms and embassies oceans away. If this message resonates with you, a woman whispered between chants, her voice barely rising above the crowd, take a second to like this video, it helps more people see it. The world needs to know. And indeed, the world was watching. From Vienna to Accra, from London to Johannesburg, a coordinated movement had taken shape, burning like wildfire through the streets and screens of the African diaspora. In front of French consulates and American embassies, the chant was the same, hands off Traoré. Hands off Africa. This was no mere protest. It was a prophecy. Traoré's rise came in the aftermath of disillusionment. Burkina Faso, like much of the Sahel, had been a battlefield, not just against insurgents, but against economic colonization masked as development and security pacts masked as protection. The people knew the pattern too well. First came promises. Then came weapons. Then came puppets. And finally came betrayal. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not wait to be handed power. He seized it, boldly, in a military-led transition that rattled the corridors of Western diplomacy. Critics called it a coup. Supporters called it a correction. But no one could deny, it sent shockwaves through Africa and beyond. Where once there was submission, now there was confrontation. Traoré moved quickly. He severed ties with France's military presence. He rejected dictates from ECOWAS and the IMF. He spoke in the language of the street and of struggle, vowing that Burkina Faso would reclaim its sovereignty not through negotiation, but through resistance. For many Africans, disillusioned by decades of false dawns, this was a revelation. Homeland or death, we will overcome, said a young man at the protest, voice trembling with passion. I am here to support our president, to defend the interest of Africa. Pan-Africanism. This is not about one country. This is about all of us. And it was. This protest, this gathering of strangers bound by hope, was not just about a man. It was about memory. About Sankara, the revolutionary once betrayed by his own. About Patrice Lumumba, whose blood still stains the conscience of a world that claims to love democracy. About Amilcar Cabral, Modibo Keïta, and the generations of leaders whose dreams were extinguished by the long fingers of foreign interference. We will not repeat history, a woman cried, holding high a portrait of Thomas Sankara. We will not allow them to do to Traoré what they did to our heroes. This time, we protect him. This time, the betrayal would not go unanswered. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, another voice urged as a speaker paused to catch breath. This story belongs to all of us. There was a fire building, not just in the protest, but in the global African spirit. One that refused to be doused by silence, censorship, or the polished voices of mainstream diplomacy. This was a raw voice, unshaped by think tanks or press releases. A voice that remembered the mines, the plantations, the IMF loans, the coups. And the voice said, no more. Traoré, meanwhile, stood under siege. Not just by enemies seen, but by those cloaked in bureaucracy and backroom deals. by economic ultimatums, by internal traitors who would sell tomorrow for today's coin, by the looming shadows of international generals like Michael Langley, whose visits whispered promises that carried hidden knives. Yet Traoré did not waver. Instead, he called on the youth. He put faith in the barefoot children who knew hunger, the jobless graduates who knew betrayal, the mothers who had buried sons in unjust wars. He told them they were the guardians of Africa's future, that the hour was now. And they answered. "You must not be scared," a speaker declared, facing the embassy steps. "The Americans must understand, their contracts are not with us. They are with corrupt leaders. We are not them. We are the youth. We are the people. We are the power." From the sidewalks of Harlem to the streets of Accra, this truth reverberated. The age of exploitation was ending, not with negotiation, but with uprising. "Subscribe and share this," said a protester holding a homemade placard. "If you believe the time for Africa to rise is now." And with that, another chant rose, low at first, then thunderous. "Africa is not yours to dictate. No more puppet presidents." Traoré is not alone. In Vienna, they called him a blueprint. In London, they shouted down imperialism. In Johannesburg, they invoked Gaddafi, not as a fallen tyrant, but as a fallen bulwark. There was pain in these memories, but also promise. Every protester bore two burdens, remembrance and responsibility. To mourn what had been lost, and to ensure it would not be lost again. And so, they spoke of a united Africa. One currency. One vision. One destiny. They imagined an Africa where carrying gold across borders wasn't a crime but a right. Where wealth meant empowerment, not imprisonment. Where the owner of the land could walk free without fear, while those who plundered it were the ones behind bars. "Let us be like Dubai," someone whispered in a prayer-like cadence. "Let us carry gold across our lands without being hunted. Let us carry our minerals with pride, not permits." Traoré, to them, was not just a leader, he was a vessel. For dreams deferred. For justice long denied. For a continent that had been told, again and again, to wait its turn. But the voices that day in Times Square said it plainly, the wait is over. And beneath the towering skyline of New York, built with the spoils of empire, polished with the sheen of global wealth, a different kind of light flickered. The light of defiance. Of a people awakening. Of a leader under siege, but never alone. If you also believe and stand with Traoré, let this story breathe beyond the screen. Share it, like it, pass it on. Because the fight for Africa's dignity does not belong to one man, it belongs to all of us. The sun was just beginning to set over Ouagadougou when the call came. It was not a call that came through wires or satellites, but one passed from elder to youth, from Market Square to University Campus, from Village Well to City Boulevard. A call older than colonization itself. Defend the land. Defend the leader. Defend the future. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young revolutionary thrust into the crucible of power, had become more than a man. He was a movement in motion. He was the reply to decades of broken promises. To G5 Sahel agreements written in Parisian boardrooms. To policies penned in Washington that never met the eyes of the African people. And with every new attack, verbal, political, or covert, the lines around him hardened. But the threat did not only come from outside. It crept through his own institutions, military brass loyal to foreign checks, technocrats trained in the language of compliance, intelligence agents who whispered to embassies in the night. Still, he stood tall. Not because he was invincible, but because he had become indispensable to a generation that refused to inherit chains. "We are tired of being exploited," said a voice at a protest in Johannesburg, rising with urgency. "I'm not talking about South Africa. I'm talking about the whole Africa. We are one. And the world must hear it." And the world was beginning to listen. This was not the first time Africa had risen. But it was the first time it had risen in sync, from Harlem to Harare, from Nairobi to Naples. This was not a rebellion of a single country. It was a continental memory erupting from the soil, louder than treaties, stronger than sanctions. Outside the U.S. Embassy in Accra, hundreds stood shoulder to shoulder. A young woman held her child in one arm and a sign in the other. "He is not Gaddafi. We will not let him fall." It was a chilling reminder. In 2011, The world watched as Muammar Gaddafi was hunted down, butchered, and discarded. Whatever one might say of his rule, his death was not a liberation, it was a warning. A leader who dared imagine an independent African economy, unanchored from the dollar, unbowed to Western oversight, was erased in the open. And now, they feared, it was happening again. Except this time, the people would not be silent. Ibrahim Traore is our hope, a speaker in Vienna declared, eyes glinting with defiance. He is the son of the poor, the brother of the broken, the father of the forgotten. If he falls, we fall. At the heart of this rising movement was not a romantic ideal, it was a reckoning. Decades of foreign bases, currency control through the CFA franc, mining contracts that robbed the earth while paying in pennies, this was not theoretical. This was lived reality. Schools with no books, hospitals with no medicine, borders where minerals flowed out and guns flowed in. And Traore, in all his youth, in all his imperfection, had said, enough. He did not beg for aid. He demanded dignity. We don't want your lectures, a protester in London screamed outside the French consulate. We don't want your aid. We want your hands off. We want what is ours. Inside Burkina Faso, the pressure was growing. Sanctions loomed. Threats whispered. Media campaigns painted him as a tyrant, a populist, a strongman. But inside the country, something unprecedented was happening. The people were organizing, not for protest, but for production. Communal farms, local security brigades, literacy programs. These weren't being broadcast on global news channels, but they were happening. Beneath the radar, beyond the grasp of foreign NGOs. Traore wasn't selling dreams, he was planting seeds. But seeds don't grow without enemies. General Michael Langley, the U.S. Africa Command head, made visits cloaked in diplomacy but draped in suspicion. Every visit brought a wave of unrest, rumors of regime change, covert deals, subtle threats. And still, Traore met him with the posture of a lion, not as a supplicant, but as a sovereign. We are not scared of you, declared a protester in South Africa, voice carried by the wind. If it means death, bring it on. We will fight. We will rise. We will not die slaves. Subscribe and share this if you believe Africa's freedom cannot be bought or bargained, another said quietly through tears. Because for many, this was not a political stance, it was spiritual. There was something sacred in the resistance. The belief that ancestors who once bore chains were watching. That their blood, spilled without justice, would now give life to liberation. That the betrayal of Sankara, the silence after Lumumba, the silence in every corridor of African history, would no longer echo unchallenged. Ibrahim is our redemption, a woman in the crowd whispered, clutching a photo of her son, killed in the north during a foreign-led operation. He speaks for those who can't speak anymore. This is what made the movement dangerous. It was not built on policy. It was built on pain. And pain, when awakened, does not ask for permission to speak. The diaspora, long scattered by war, opportunity, and exile, was finding its center again. Traore had become a symbol not because he was perfect, but because he was present. Because he dared to do what so many others would not, speak truth with the military still behind him and the masses still beside him. Even the language had changed. No longer were Africans abroad speaking of reform. They spoke of revolution, of sovereignty, of standing tall, and of betrayal, not from enemies, but from those within who traded African futures for Western applause. Do not be scared, said a speaker outside the French embassy in Washington, D.C. They do not fear our guns. They fear our unity. Tell us where you're watching from. Let them know we are everywhere, another protester urged, her voice crackling through live-stream static. The internet had become the battleground. Governments scrambled to label dissent as misinformation, to ban accounts, to shut down networks. But the truth had already spread. And in that truth, a new African consciousness was emerging. In classrooms in Nairobi, students debated the meaning of Pan-Africanism not as history, but as destiny. In Lagos, artists painted murals of Traore with Sankara's silhouette behind him. In Kigali, youth groups read out loud the speeches of Nkrumah and Cabral, not as relics but as roadmaps. The message was unshakable. Africa will no longer be shaped from outside. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré faced another long night. Reports of betrayal circled. There were whispers of a coup, backed quietly by foreign interests. There were meetings he could not attend, decisions made in shadows. But there was also something else. Something stronger. Thousands of youth flooded the streets. Not to demand his resignation, but to form a shield. They sang. They wept. They vowed that if he were taken, they would take his place. "We failed Gaddafi," one youth said. "We will not fail Traoré." And the world watched, not with curiosity, but with unease. Because a new question had been asked. What happens when Africa stops asking? The answer was not found in speeches or statements, but in the determined march of feet across continents, in the digital chorus of voices, in the quiet resistance of those who would no longer be pawns in someone else's game. This was not just protest. It was the birth of a continent reclaiming itself. And as night fell, the chant still echoed. One Africa. One struggle. One future. If this story moves you, share it now. Let the truth reach beyond borders and beyond fear. The time is now. The world is watching. The silence in the corridors of international diplomacy had grown deafening. Official communiques spoke in clinical tones, concern, regional instability, the need for democratic transitions. But on the ground, in Burkina Faso, the people were wide awake. There was no silence in the alleys of Bobo Dioulasso or the dusty roads of Kaya. No calm in the hearts of mothers who had buried sons in the name of stability. The truth rang louder than any press release. Africa's children were standing up, and they were not asking for permission. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had become a lodestar in this storm, not because he had commanded it, but because he had refused to abandon it. He was not naive. He knew what history held for leaders like him. They always came with hope, and they always died too soon. Sankara had been killed by his own. Lumumba was delivered to his enemies by the hands of his countrymen. Cabral, gunned down before he could taste the freedom he fought for. The lesson had been brutal. Foreign powers rarely pulled the trigger without local fingers on the handle. And yet, Traoré moved forward, knowing the dangers weren't lurking just beyond Burkina Faso's borders. They were already inside them. In the gilded halls of government, there were men wearing his uniform, speaking his slogans, who were already plotting his fall. Soldiers who smiled for the camera but whispered to foreign advisors. Ministers who praised his vision but signed secret agreements with outside handlers. Still, the people kept watch. At a protest in Paris, where the air was thick with ancestral rage, a young woman shouted into a megaphone, "This is not just about Burkina Faso. This is about betrayal. This is about all of Africa. Our leaders have sold us before. They will not sell us again." It was more than a protest. It was an indictment. "We know what you did to Sankara," another protester declared. "We know who trained the ones who killed him. We know how you smeared his name before you erased him. But this time, we are watching." And they were. Across telegram channels, encrypted networks, and whispered circles, the diaspora began tracking not just Traoré's speeches, but the movements of those around him. They were studying the patterns, who visited which embassy, which generals had shifted tone, which regional leaders had suddenly changed posture. It was not paranoia. It was pattern recognition. Because the machinery of interference had never stopped, it had just changed its tactics. Instead of outright coups, there were transitions. Instead of colonization, there was partnership. And instead of soldiers in boots, there were technocrats in suits. But the mission remained the same: control the gold, the land, the people. In Burkina Faso, Traoré had dared to cut the strings. He expelled foreign forces under the guise of security cooperation. He nationalized sectors once handed off to French and Canadian multinationals. He redirected education funding toward Pan-African curricula. And most threatening of all, he began serious talks with neighboring states about a new currency, an end to the CFA franc, that colonial relic dressed in modern garb. It was, to Western powers, a declaration of war by other means. "Why are they afraid of one man?" asked a speaker at the Vienna protest. "Because he speaks the truth. Because he believes in our sovereignty more than in their systems. Because he can't be bought." The rallying cry grew sharper. In Ghana, students held seminars in open-air circles, studying Traoré's policies like scripture. In Cameroon, Youth councils printed posters bearing his image alongside Nkrumah's, reading, "Not another martyr, this time, we protect." The sense of urgency rippled across borders. Meanwhile, in closed-door meetings in foreign capitals, the usual dance began. Threats dressed as negotiations. Incentives masked as aid. Offers laced with betrayal. But Traoré refused to flinch. In a late-night address broadcast across Burkina Faso's state media, he looked into the camera, not as a politician, but as a brother. "They will say I am alone," he said, his voice low and steady. "They will say I cannot govern. They will say I bring danger. But I say this to them, I am not alone. The people are awake. And Africa will no longer be their laboratory." His words reached beyond the Sahel. They landed like thunder in the hearts of African youth worldwide. One young man in Nairobi recorded a response, tears in his eyes. "You are not alone, Captain. You are with us. And we are with you. This is our time." "If these words speak to your spirit," he added softly, "share this video. Let them see we are more than voices. We are fire. Fire." That's what Traoré had become. Not a flame to warm the room, but a blaze to burn down what no longer served Africa's future. The elites hated him. Not because he was dangerous, but because he was real. He didn't play by their rules. He didn't worship their institutions. He didn't wait for approval from Paris or Washington. And for every step he took away from their grasp, 1,000 youth took a step forward behind him. He wasn't building a state. He was awakening a movement. Back in Burkina Faso, the threat escalated. Intelligence reports warned of a coup attempt being prepared. Not from the opposition, but from his own command. From men who wore the same boots, carried the same rifles, and bore the same flag. Traoré's response was swift. He reshuffled key positions. Removed commanders who had grown too comfortable. Placed loyalists in charge of the Presidential Guard. And most importantly, he called the people to witness. At a massive gathering in the capital, tens of thousands arrived, unarmed but resolute. They filled the streets with chants, songs, and unshakable purpose. Homeland or death. Captain or chaos. Africa is rising. These were not slogans. These were vows. The world had underestimated one thing: loyalty born of truth. "I would rather die standing for Traoré," said a woman with tears in her eyes, "than live kneeling for a puppet." This loyalty could not be manufactured. It could not be bribed. It was forged in the furnace of history, of stolen children, stolen lands, and stolen futures. Now, the people were reclaiming all three. "Tell us in the comments where you stand," a protester in London said as cameras panned across the crowd. "Let them know we are not isolated. We are not few. We are millions." That night, across Africa's digital landscape, one phrase began trending: "We are the wall." It wasn't just about protecting Traoré. It was about protecting what he represented. A chance. A path. A vision of Africa where leaders answered to their people, not their funders. Traoré knew his time could be short. But that didn't matter. Because something had already been set in motion. A tidal wave of consciousness. Of courage. A young girl in Dakar painted a mural of him, her tiny hands dipping in earth-colored paint. She looked up at the wall as she worked and whispered, "Don't be scared, Captain. We've got you. If this moment moves you, share this story. Not for views, but for vision. Let your voice join the chorus that says, Africa will never bow again." Darkness has many forms. For much of Africa's post-independence history, it has come cloaked in foreign flags and friendly handshakes, in smiling diplomats and neatly signed trade agreements. It has spoken the language of partnership while bleeding the continent dry. It has worn 1,000 masks: aid, security, investment, peacekeeping, but its aim has always been the same: control. Captain Ibrahim Traoré knew this. He had grown up in the belly of that beast, trained in its military systems, briefed in its command structures, surrounded by men who saluted flags but served foreign masters. But something inside him broke free. Some memory deeper than military loyalty, some wound older than policy, some calling louder than fear. And that's what made him dangerous. Because Traoré had crossed the line, not just from soldier to statesman, but from compliant actor to independent thinker. And history had shown again and again, when an African leader dreams beyond the script, the world answers with force. But this time, Africa answered back. In Accra, outside the walls of the U.S. Embassy, the streets trembled not from tanks but from footsteps. The youth stood shoulder to shoulder, some in t-shirts, some in dashikis, some in school uniforms. They carried handmade signs, drawn in marker and blood memory. Burkina Faso is not yours. We failed Sankara. We won't fail Traoré. One currency. One Africa. One speaker took the microphone, voice shaking not from fear but from fury. They want us to carry guns, but not gold. They want us to kill, but not grow. If you carry your own mineral, they call you a criminal. But if you carry their weapon, they call you an ally. The crowd erupted. The air was electric. The truth was no longer hidden in books or buried in archives. It was alive, in the voices of the young. In South Africa, a crowd gathered under a vast mural of Nelson Mandela. A young woman, barely 20, stepped onto a makeshift stage and shouted, "The time for begging is over. This is not about foreign aid, it's about African blood. We are tired of watching our heroes die. This is not a protest. It is an awakening." From Cape Town to Casablanca, the language of liberation returned, not as nostalgia, but as necessity. And at the center of it all, like a lightning rod cracking open a colonial sky, stood Ibrahim Traore. He did not ask for global approval. He asked his people to remember who they were. And that was enough. Inside Burkina Faso, he continued to face storms, covert economic sabotage, pressure from neighboring regimes aligned with foreign powers, whispers of assassination, and threats too numerous to name. Yet even as the air thickened with risk, Traoré leaned further into his vision. He convened open councils with village leaders. He broadcast messages not in French, but in Moor and Diola. He walked among his people without armored convoys. These were not stunts, they were strategy. Traoré understood, if they could isolate him from his people, they could destroy him. So he did the opposite. He dissolved the distance. He made the revolution personal. "He walks like one of us," said a farmer outside Fodden Gourma. "Not above us. Not behind us. With us." The symbolism was not lost on the West. Nor was the threat. Across diplomatic cables, Traoré was described as unpredictable, destabilizing, anti-democratic, the same labels once given to Nkrumah, Sankara, and Lumumba before foreign operatives helped end their rule. The same euphemisms for too African to be tolerated. But this time, the West had a problem. The world was watching. Too many cameras. Too many voices. Too many young people with phones, with facts, with fury. They couldn't just erase him in the dark. They would have to come for him in the light. And Africa would not allow it. "If you touch him," said a protester in Bamako, "you will see what resistance really looks like." Traoré had become more than a man. He had become a covenant. And it wasn't just the diaspora speaking now. Elders who had once been silent were rising. Artists, poets, street preachers, musicians, filmmakers. The creative force of a continent had been unleashed, and it was telling one story in many tongues. Africa belongs to Africans. In a powerful video that went viral, a young girl in Zimbabwe stood before a hand-painted African map and spoke with the clarity of generations. "Our minerals are not yours. Our mines are not yours. Our futures are not for sale." The video reached millions. And at a protest in Lagos, someone played it on a loudspeaker. The crowd went silent, reverent. Then a chant erupted. "We are the future. We are the gold. We are the resistance." It wasn't just symbolic. On the ground, movements were taking shape to resist not just foreign governments but local collaborators, bankers, politicians, generals, and media figures who had long served as middlemen for exploitation. In Burkina Faso, new legislation proposed stricter control over foreign mining firms. In Guinea, rallies began calling for a West African Union outside of ECOWAS. In Côte d'Ivoire, youth movements openly defied pro-French media narratives, declaring support for a united Pan-African front. "We are no longer divided by flags," a young speaker said. "We are united by fire." "Tell us in the comments where your fire is burning," he added. "Let the world know, Africa is no longer sleeping." Traoré, ever aware of history's weight, began invoking it more openly. In a speech delivered at a rural school, he said, "They will try to paint me as a dictator. But remember this, a dictator serves himself. I serve you. If I die, let that truth survive." There was no need for applause. There was only silence, then tears. No one knew how long he would survive. No one could predict how the next months would unfold. But one thing was clear, something irreversible had begun. A reckoning. A resurrection. A redefinition of African leadership, not based on degrees, alliances, or donor conferences, but on the unshakable bond between leader and people. "If you believe we are witnessing a new chapter of African history," a voice said at the end of a protest video from Brussels, "subscribe, share, and remember this moment. It may be the one they don't teach, but it's the one we must live." There are moments in a nation's story that do not begin with a gunshot or a headline, but with a whisper that becomes a wave. What began as the echo of a single voice in Burkina Faso had now become a global chant, a cry rising from the heart of a silenced continent. We will not be ruled in shadows anymore. By now, it wasn't just protests that filled the streets, it was a pilgrimage of principle. African descendants from around the world, Guyanese, Haitians, Afro-Brazilians, African-Americans, raised their fists not just for Traoré, but for what he dared to stand for, a world where Africa no longer bowed, where its leaders no longer served two masters, and where its youth no longer fought for crumbs tossed from foreign tables. The stakes had become undeniable. In Burkina Faso, every day was a test. With every decree that placed the nation's wealth back in its people's hands, with every rejection of foreign diktats, the threats multiplied. Whispers of plots and assassinations intensified. Drones flew lower. Surveillance deepened. Delegations arrived with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. And still, Traoré walked among his people. A grainy video circulated, him at a rural mine site, without body armor, helping workers assess a collapsed shaft. He didn't come to cut ribbons or deliver speeches. He came to listen. A boy barely 12 reached out and touched his fatigues. "Are you scared?" the boy asked. Traoré knelt, looked him in the eye and said, "Only of failing you." That image traveled farther than any press conference ever could. In a world where leadership had been reduced to spectacle and spin, here was a man being seen, not staged. Not sanitized. Just present. It terrified the powerful. Because a leader who lives in the hearts of his people cannot be overthrown quietly. Because a man who speaks the language of dignity cannot be buried in the language of diplomacy. Because once people see what freedom could look like, they can no longer be lied to about what oppression is. Across the African continent, something tectonic shifted. In Senegal, students wrote letters to Traoré, calling him our brother in the storm. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, community organizers began holding weekly gatherings called Traoré Circles, forums where young Africans discussed politics, sovereignty, and the unfinished business of liberation. In diaspora communities, Toronto, Rio, Paris, Atlanta, the question was the same: what now? Because the truth had become irreversible, Traoré was no longer a Burkinabe issue. He had become the litmus test for African independence in the 21st century. And if they could silence him, they could silence the dream again. But that dream was louder now. One Africa, one voice, became more than a chant. It became an organizing principle. Digital coalitions sprang up, Pan-African legal defense funds, independent media alliances, African fintech collectives building toward the elusive goal of a single currency. No longer were they waiting for institutions built to restrain them, they were building their own. This was no longer a protest. This was preparation. And so, the final phase began, not with violence, but with vision. Traoré unveiled a continental summit, not of heads of state, but of African youth leaders, farmers, technologists, and thinkers. He called it the Sankara Assembly, a symbolic restoration of a dream denied in 1987, now reborn in 2025. "We are not gathering to discuss how to survive," he said in his opening remarks. "We are here to decide how we will thrive." The room exploded. Not with applause, but with resolve. Around the world, millions watched live. "This is our history," said a woman in Johannesburg, tears running down her cheeks. "And this time, we will write it ourselves." There was no delusion. Everyone knew what might come next. The history of this continent is filled with tombs built for those who dreamed too loud. But Traoré had ignited something they couldn't bomb, buy, or blacklist. An idea whose time had come. And that idea was not fragile. It was fierce. At a vigil in New York, outside the same building where thousands had once gathered in April, an old man held a candle and whispered, "They could never kill the dream. Not Sankara's. Not Lumumba's. Not now. We've seen it too clearly." Then, as if on cue, a new chant rose, calm, strong, and echoing through the steel canyons of the city. Africa is rising. Africa is standing. Africa will not sit back down. Because the world had drawn its line. Because the youth had made their vow. Because whether he stood for another month or another decade, Ibrahim Traoré had done something that could not be undone. He had dared to believe that Africa could be free in our lifetime. And he had made millions believe it too. If this story lives in you, share it. Speak it. Stand with it. Tell us where you're watching from. The world is watching us. Let them see a continent that is no longer waiting. Let them see Africa, standing.